Barbara, you are muted.
Got it? All right. Good morning. My name's Barbara Griswold. I'd like to welcome all of you to the first General Topics Fab Friday presentation for the spring term. We're part of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, known as OLLI, at UNC Asheville. And I'm co-chair of a committee that arranges these events, which are open to OLLI members and non-members alike. There will be 5 more of these virtual presentations this term, and you can find details about them either in the OLLI Observer newsletters, if you get those, or by typing OLLI Asheville into a search engine and looking there. Next week, on April 2nd, we will have a topic all about COVID-19 being presented by Mission Health's Director of Epidemiology, so a very timely topic. 2 weeks from today, April 9, Dr. Marcia Gordon, who is the Professor of Film Studies at NC State, will examine the way educational and governmental films portrayed race in the 1980s to the 1970s. There'll be many short film clips to illustrate her talk and time for your recollections and questions. And these may remind you of films you might have seen in junior high and high school, perhaps. And now for today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dan Pierce. He is the UNCA Interdisciplinary Distinguished Professor of the Mountain South. He teaches about Appalachia, North Carolina, the national parks, and related topics. But not one to be weighed down by titles, he has been known to refer to himself as the resident professional hillbilly. Today, Dan will be expanding our knowledge of the extraordinary effort that brought the railroad up over the Blue Ridge Escarpment to Asheville, in the Asheville area around the late 1870s. The use of incarcerated laborers, prison labor in this Jim Crow era, to actually make this vision a reality is not typically in the focus of its history. Tunnels were blasted with crude explosives. Hand tools were used to clear the trees, level the land, and lay the rails. He's going to tell us more about that history and also about efforts underway now to honor the memory of these workers. So after his presentation, there'll be a generous period for Q&A, and you can enter your questions by using the Q&A button, probably at the bottom of your screen. Type them in there, and we expect our program to run a little more than an hour, maybe an hour and a quarter. We'll see how we go with questions. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Dan Pierce.
Thank you, Barbara. And it's good to be with OLLI folks, even though I can't see you out there, but it's my pleasure. I've had the good fortune of working with what used to be called the College for Seniors early in my career at UNC Asheville, and then in the last several years with OLLI on a number of occasions. And so it's a pleasure to come to you today and talk about something that is, I guess, near and dear to my heart. And so you won't have to look at me. I'm going to share a screen and a PowerPoint here. So you can have some visuals here. So let me do that real quick. And then make this. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking today about the construction of the railroad up the Blue Ridge Escarpment through Swannanoa Gap, or under Swannanoa Gap, actually, into Asheville. And this is an amazing accomplishment. If any of your railroad buffs, this is something that people who are really into railroads, and there are a lot of people like that, surprising numbers of them, from all over the world, come to this area to see this particular grade. And it's a very amazing engineering accomplishment that occurred in the late 1870s, roughly 1877 to 1879. And of course, this was, a crucial, something that had been hoped for and envisioned for a long time. Zeb Vance, it was one of his major, something he pushed for as a congressman, a U.S. congressman before the Civil War, and then something that he took up as a major project as governor when he was got a second term in 1876. And so this was a project, there was a lot of frustration, there were a lot of failures in terms of getting the project going. And two of the major people involved in this prior to 1877 absconded with millions of dollars in funds intended for the railroad. They were eventually caught, I think they caught up with it in England. So there were a lot of problems in terms of this. And of course, one of the big problems that you had in terms of constructing this railroad is the topography and the terrain. So this is, you can see if you look, and I'll wiggle my cursor around here. If you see right here, this straight line, this is roughly where I-40 runs right now. If you're familiar with where I'm talking about. So this is the, if you're familiar with the Ridgecrest Conference Center and the gigantic cross on the side of the mountain at the eastern end of Buncombe County. So Asheville or Black Mountain Ridgecrest would be right here. And then down here is Old Fort. And so this is the distance between Ridgecrest and Old Fort is about 3.4 miles. The way into Western North Carolina prior to the construction of the railroad followed Swannanoa Creek here. And this is, I don't know how I should put this, but it's a fun hike. You can go down and down around the bottom of the Point Lookout Greenway, which is a wonderful place to go. This is in the western end of McDowell County, just over the county line. And if you follow the old road down, there's a gate there at the start of the Point Lookout Greenway, which runs about 4 miles down almost to the Old Fort picnic area. There's a little road there that you can get on from the bottom and hike up that pretty much follows this old road here. There are actually a couple of graves on it. One is a grave of a Confederate soldier, and then there's further on up, there's a grave of a Union soldier. There was a battle here at Swannanoa Gap back at the very end of the Civil War in April of 1865. And so, but anyway, this was the old road, or what they called the Stagecoach Road. Now, not too sure of my facts here on this, but the legend at least has it that at the very end, when it was climbing up to the gap, that they would make the people in the stagecoaches get out and walk up the hill to save the horses because it was such a steep grade. And so that's the old road. Here's this pretty much follows the new road, I-40. And then later, US 70 was built that is up above the stream. And again, that's the Point Lookout Greenway. It's the old roadbed of US 70. So you can see that there were, three routes or have been historically three routes that pretty much go straight up, follow the mountain up about 3.4 miles. Well, the problem with a railroad is that you can't, and I'm not exactly sure what the grade is, but the railroad has to have a lower grade. And so it was a major challenge because it's about, what does it say? It's almost 1,000 feet, 891 feet elevation gain between Old Fort and the Swannanoa Gap. And so in order to have a grade that was that a locomotive could climb, pulling passengers and cargo, you can see the route of the railroad in black here, and see that it pretty much follows Mill Creek up here until you get up around what's now Andrews Geyser, right in here, this round knob right here. And then it actually shows Andrews Geyser right there. And then it starts to make these switchbacks and loops that wind up the mountain. In addition, and this shows some of them, I guess maybe it shows all of them, but anyway, but particularly in the upper end up here, there are also a number of tunnels. There are a total of 7 tunnels between Old Fort and the Swannanoa Gap. So, but again, you can see this is about, so, as the crow flies, or pretty much as I-40 runs, as the old roads run, it was a little over 3 miles. The railroad, in order to get it up the mountain, runs about 9 miles. And this railroad, and by the way, this railroad is still there today, although it's very limited traffic. Someone told me the other day there are only about 3 trains running on this railroad. But again, this is a place, this track, and people, Norfolk Southern has lots of no trespassing signs up there, and we should all follow the law, but people do walk parts of the tracks here. But it is a fascinating thing, and you can drive down Mill Creek Road, which is a dirt road. At least part of the way follows much of this coming down from Ridgecrest there. So, but anyway, it's something that has fascinated people, that railroad historians and railroad buffs have written a lot about over the years, and it is an amazing accomplishment, particularly when you look at the time period. This is the 1870s that this was built. Most of this stretch of railroad was built using hand tools, although a lot the tunnels and some of the cuts in here were blasted using Alfred Nobel's new invention, nitroglycerin. And so you see this at the top, and again, all these tunnels at the top is the Swannanoa Tunnel, which that song that you heard on the way in is an old song done by lots and lots of people called Swannanoa Tunnel. All caved in, all caved in. And we'll talk about that. But the Swannanoa Tunnel is one of the longest rail tunnels east of the Rockies, and is kind of it's one of those you really can't see the other end. It bends a little bit, and it's so long. It's about 1/3 of a mile long, so it's a very, very long tunnel. And so that's probably the most famous part of this grade, and again is something that's in engineering and railroad lore to this day. So again, we'll probably come back to this map as we go, because I want to show you some things, but let's move on now. One part of the history that has been known for a relatively long time, but really not talked about a great deal, but is how this railroad, again, in the late 1870s, was constructed. And the labor on this railroad was done by people, overwhelmingly men, overwhelmingly African-American men. About 90+% of the railroad workers were were African American, many of them, or most of them, former slaves, that were incarcerated in the state, in the North Carolina State Penitentiary, or had been sentenced to the North Carolina State Penitentiary. You can see this was, I'm not exactly sure the date on when this was issued. It was a contemporary photo, although Steve Little thinks it was on the stretch between Ridgecrest and Asheville that this was taken for a variety of reasons that he knows, and then was later colorized. But you can see that this was intended to be a humorous postcard that says stripes but no stars. And so welcome to Asheville, North Carolina. So the article there describes the work and the number of men. At that point, this is 1878. Eventually, over the course of construction of the railroad up the mountain, there were, according to penitentiary records, about 3,000 incarcerated individuals who worked on the railroad. And again, this is, all of that work to build the railroad, to dig the tunnels, to cut through the mountain here. You can see a cut that they're working on here was done by incarcerated people. Now, one thing about this, and I use, generally speaking, and this was something that, was common at the time, the whole use of incarcerated people for infrastructure projects. During this period, again, all over the South in particular, for one thing, because of the Civil War and other factors, these states were virtually bankrupt and had little money to incarcerate people. And so this was a way that not only could the state not have to house these people in penitentiaries and the expense that involved, but they could also make money. So in a lot of cases, this, what has generally been called the convict labor system, or convict lease system, that convicts were leased out by the state to private corporations for things like building railroads. In some cases they were hired out for agricultural labor or for cutting timber or things like that. So leased out to private companies who were responsible for guarding them, paying for their food and housing and clothing, that type of thing. So they would pay a fee to the state. So it was a way of the state, which didn't have a lot of options in terms of revenue at the time, to make some revenue. In this case, this was a state project. And so this was a matter of the state taking convicts that were in the penitentiary system and putting them to work building this. And so this was a high priority of the state at the time. And the influence of Zeb Vance was very strong because he was governor when this began. And, it was a very high priority for Vance. So again, they sent, over the course of the construction, about over 3,000 laborers, to convict laborers, incarcerated people, to work on the railroad. Now, again, the reason that I use, and we decided in this project that I'll tell you about in a little bit, to use the term incarceration instead of convict, is because of the circumstances. We've had a lot of talk in recent days, in the last year and more, but particularly in the last year, about this notion of institutional racism and its history in the United States. And this is a case here where it is really undeniable that this was a case of institutional racism. And so I'll read you this clip. This was from the Asheville Citizen in 1878. It says, on the line of the Western North Carolina Railroad towards Asheville, from the tunnel, 3 stockades are to be built for convicts and 700 are to be sent immediately. And then this is the key part right here. The supply of convicts at the penitentiary is not sufficient, and the word will be sent out to the prosecuting officers to bring before the courts a larger number of offenders. You don't have to read much between the lines to understand what that little clip is saying right there. And I want to let me say that thank Ann Chesky Smith of the Western North Carolina Historical Association for finding this clip, because it is, if you ever saw a smoking gun, this is one. And I remember well the first time I saw this, that it really, and it still, I think every time I see it, it gives me chills to think about what happened to so many of these men, because essentially what this is talking about is that round up every African-American vagrant you can find and try them for vagrancy or petty theft or something like that. A lot of these people were convicted on very, what would kindly be characterized as spurious charges. Things like vagrancy or again, petty theft under what were so-called pig laws at the time. But then they were for these very minor, if they had done it at all. And again, the word of a law enforcement official, a sheriff's deputy or a policeman in any of these cases against essentially homeless African-American, you can imagine how that went in the courts. And so many of these people were unjustly accused of crimes. And even if they had committed a crime, it was something very minor. But a standard offense in many of these cases was 3 years at hard labor. And so most of the individuals, we don't know we don't have the full records on these individuals, but most of these individuals were convicted of crimes that either they didn't do or were given sentences that were just way out of proportion to any offense they may have committed. And so again, this is, really gives us a clear picture about what's going on. And again, over 3,000 individuals who worked on the railroad at hard labor. And this was hard labor, 6 days a week, pretty much sun up to sundown, every day but Sunday for a whole year. Along the way, there are a number. One, the work that these individuals are doing is extremely dangerous, and there weren't a whole lot of safety concerns. As this reads here, this is a clip from one of my former students who did really some of the best research anyone has done in the penitentiary records down in Raleigh. Wilson is James Wilson, who was the chief engineer on the project and has been glorified in lots of ways for his genius in bringing this up. But as it says here, Wilson's Mountain Division performed most of the primary construction from Old Fort to the Swannanoa Tunnel from 1877 through 1879. During that time, losses for all the contractors working convicts on the road totaled 139 deaths, 9.7% for the 3 years based on the average number of workers per month. And so we know, based on the penitentiary records, that at least, and probably more, we do know several people were shot trying to escape, and I don't believe that those numbers are reflected here. And so you can see a short clip here from the Morganton newspaper in 1879. A Negro convict was killed Thursday near the Swannanoa Tunnel. Others were wounded. A jug of powder accidentally fired was the trouble. And so again, you know, the dangers of this work were considerable, particularly when you throw in, you know, doing these cuts and doing these tunnels with nitroglycerin, which notoriously, particularly the earlier versions, notoriously unstable. And then the potential for cave-ins in the tunnels, or any number of these, you know, just random rock falls that killed individuals, and then larger cave-ins that killed numbers. You know, we don't have a lot of details on these, but again, we do know, according to the penitentiary records, that at least 139 of these incarcerated workers were died in the process of construction in that 2.5 year period of building that railroad up the mountain. They were buried in unmarked graves. We don't know where. We have some ideas, but we don't really know where those graves are located. But again, that stretch of railroad is a mass graveyard, particularly the upper part where so many of the tunnels and so many of the cuts were made, the most dangerous part of that construction. So if the dangers of construction were not enough, let's see, the living conditions of these workers were abysmal. The state allocated a tiny amount of state funds for the upkeep of these prisoners, in terms of their food, in terms of their clothing, in terms of their medical care, in terms of their housing. This is the largest of the. There were stockades, several stockades built along the route to house the prisoners, and this was the largest one of these, the Round Knob Stockade. Again, these incarcerated individuals were, fed on pennies a day. They got one set of clothes, no coats, which was, these uniforms were for year round. They got no coats. They did get hats, but no coats, warm clothing, things like that. They were crowded together in these cabins. In some case, they slept in boxcars crowded in together. So they had a poor diet, which was primarily cornmeal and maybe and beans, and on occasions a little bit of salt pork, and that was about it. And so their diet, their health care was limited. So those 139 that died, and we don't know exact numbers of cause of death on these, but significant numbers died due to disease, because again, they're out working in all weather. They have a poor diet. They're ill clothed, and again, it was a deadly situation. So you can see that for relatively minor crimes, again, if they actually committed any, that some of these people were given a death sentence, and others not only may have been injured, incurred injuries that lasted for the rest of their life, that they felt the effects of, or from diseases and the poor diet and the overall working conditions of these people. So again, about 3,000 people, we know for sure 139 died. Let me just go back to my map here. We have recently, Steve Little found in some of the penitentiary, actually some of the legislative records, there was a map there that showed the location, because we really didn't know where the Round Knob camp, we know where Round Knob is, but we didn't know where the Round Knob camp is. And actually, if you can see my cursor there, where it says Round Knob right there, that is where that camp was. And we thought the reference on the map was to Round Knob, which is a little knob right there. There's used to be kind of there was a resort there, and then a number of things. There's kind of a cabin there. I think it's privately owned now. But right in the upper end of that loop, and actually the road, Mill Creek Road, goes right through here. But right in the upper end of that loop, there's some houses in there now, and the road goes through there. It's where the Round Knob stockade was located. And so that's kind of a exciting thing to discover the exact location. We haven't walked through there. That's all private property, and people don't necessarily want you walking through there, and they may not want to know exactly if they don't know what was there 150 years ago or so, 140 years ago. So again, that's the location of the Round Knob stockade, but up and down the line, there were several other stockades that housed prisoners. So in the aftermath of construction, James Wilson became somewhat of a hero. I wouldn't say somewhat, he was a hero. He was lauded by many. There's a memorial down next to the Old Fort the old Old Fort train depot. And you can see that the caboose there in the background. There's a memorial to James Wilson down there, and he has been written about as a hero in a lot of the literature. Railroad buffs all over the world talk about his accomplishment. There's also at Round Knob, in that area, there is a park and a geyser. It's not a natural geyser. It's fed by a pond further up the mountain that has enough force of gravity to shoot a pretty impressive plume of water up. But this is what's called Andrews Geyser, which was this is the second Andrews Geyser. Actually, there was one built in conjunction with the hotel, which was right on the railroad line there in this area, and then this was later built in the early 1900s as a memorial to an official of the Southern Railroad who really had no involvement at the time in construction of what's called the Swannanoa Grade. But Andrews, was a major official with the Southern Railroad, and so Andrews Geyser. This was owned by the railroad for a number of years. It had fallen into disrepair, and actually, Steve Little, as a young lawyer in Marion, was instrumental in first trying to force the Southern Railroad, who had acquired the property, into fulfilling an obligation to maintain it and keep it up, which they hadn't. And then when the states, through Steve's efforts, told the Southern Railroad they needed to honor their commitment, they ended up donating the land to the town of Old Fort. So this is a park now owned by the town of Old Fort. But again, memorializing Andrews, so the people associated with the railroad, and Andrews is associated with the completion of the Western North Carolina Railroad, because it was bought later by the Southern Railroad and completed all the way to Murphy in the 1880s. But there is little or no mention of the incarcerated laborers who built this railroad. About the only thing we have in sort of anything is this state marker, which is at the top of the Swannanoa Gap. Incidentally, the Swannanoa Tunnel runs under I-40 right at the top of the mountain. And we have this marker here, and it says, has one sentence there, constructed by convict labor. And that's it. There's no mention, no public mention anywhere to the labor of these individuals and the sacrifice of these individuals, the ultimate sacrifice in many cases. And so this is still there at the top of the mountain. So I guess one of the, well, there are some, again, we have the tracks that are still there. We have these tunnels, which in some ways, and we have these unmarked graves, which are a memorial to these people who built the railroad. There's also, although its origins were unclear up until pretty recently, where a couple of Warren Wilson college professors have been doing research in recent years on the song that I played at the beginning, Swannanoa Tunnel, which is kind of a classic, standard old time and bluegrass song. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to read, some of you may have seen their webinar, their relatively recent webinar that Warren Wilson did. So this is Kevin Kerberg and Jeff Keith. Kevin is in the music department and Jeff is in the history department there. But they've been doing research on this song. They wrote this incredible article in the Bitter Southerner, which is an e-zine or whatever you want to call it, an online magazine. But their research, again, into this song and the origins of this song, a lot of people credited that song to an Nashville legend by the name of Bascom Lamar Lunsford, who was kind of a legendary song catcher and the founder and chief force behind the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival, which started, I believe, about 1929 and is still going on to this day. But what they discovered, and it's not surprising, that the origins of this song are not from local musicians, but from the incarcerated workers themselves. That this was, in effect, this song was a hammer song, what they call a hammer song. And they, and I should have written this down, I can't remember, this gentleman on the right there was delivered the mail at Duke University, delivered the campus mail at Duke University for like 40 years. And a folklorist at Duke recorded him singing a number of traditional songs, most of those spirituals and gospel songs. But he sang a version of Swannanoa Tunnel, and it kind of been lost in the archives for years until Kevin and Jeff kind of discovered it and unearthed it. And it is the Swannanoa Tunnel song. You know, the words similar, the tune similar, although there are all kinds of versions of both. But oh gosh, that's criminal that I don't have his name. But anyway, it's in the article. They talk all about discovering this and actually talking to family members about him. And but it's if you're familiar with these work songs that were done by slaves and then African Americans later in prison gangs and to set a tempo for work. And so the song, so it's kind of Swannanoa Tunnel, huh, And so it's punctuated by this, which are cues for hammer to set a rhythm for hammer strikes. So when you are either pounding rails into the, to attach the tracks to the cross ties, or when you are, people kind of misunderstand how these tunnels were created and what, and that song John Henry, about what John Henry was up to. John Henry was a hammer man, and what he was doing, and if you listen to the words of that song, it talks about a shaker. And so a shaker was a guy who held about a 6 feet long piece of iron with like a big head on the top of it, like a nail head. And then it was, corkscrew. It was a drill. And so what they would do would be to drill holes in the side of the mountain, and then they would pack those with either gunpowder or nitroglycerin. And then people hopefully would get out of the way, and then they would blow that, and then it would, create bigger holes, and then they would pull the debris out, and that's how they dug tunnels, and that's how they made cuts in many cases. And so these songs were used to kind of punctuate, when you would make a strike with your hoe, or when you would make a strike with your hammer in these projects. And so that's the origin of this song, is a hammer song that came in. So, we don't have definitive, Jeff and Kevin don't have definitive, but it's pretty obvious that the origins of this song. So that's one thing that is left, but there is no memorial to these. And so to these workers and what they did. So I live right at, within half a mile of the Swannanoa Gap and the Swannanoa Tunnel. And I spend a lot of time in this area. I'm very fortunate to live up here. I spend a lot of time hiking and biking around the area, and I'm by these tunnels and by these tracks constantly. I've lived here about 5 years now. And time doesn't go by really when I'm along the tracks that I don't think about those individuals who are buried in unmarked graves along the tracks, and the people that built that survived as well. But this amazing accomplishment that they did, and there's no real indication or any sort of memorial. Steve Little is an old friend of mine. We share connections to a boys camp, which is right up here as well, just on the other side of the interstate from the Ridgecrest Conference Center, Camp Ridgecrest for Boys. So we both go way back at that camp, and Steve and I have known each other for almost 40 years. But Steve is from Smithfield, down the eastern part of the state, but he came to camp as a summer. He got fascinated as a kid the first time he went to Andrews Geyser. He was about 9 or 10 probably. And it's been an obsession with him ever since. Some of you may have heard Steve speak before. He does kind of a one-man thing in a convict laborer uniform. And he's written several books on this area, this immediate area here. But he went to Wake Forest He went to Wake Forest, and he actually did his senior thesis there on the construction of the railroad. And then since then, he has done several books on the area. When he finished law school, he moved to Marion. Has been there ever since with a very successful law practice. But he is, for the last, gosh, I don't even know. He's, how small towns can be. He's kind of mayor for life there, and so he is still the mayor of Marion. But again, has maintained his fascination with this. So Steve and I just, out of conversations over the years, last summer, we got together on my porch on July 7th and over breakfast, and we talked for about 3 hours about the need for there to be a memorial. And so out of that meeting, we put together a list of individuals from McDowell County and from Buncombe County as well, to come together and create a committee to try and create a memorial at Andrews Geyser. And so we put that committee together, which has been a wonderful group to work with. You know, we have several historians and people connected to historical organizations, including the Western North Carolina Historical Association, the Western Regional Office of Archives and History, with the Mountain Gateway Museum down at Old Fort, Jim Stokely, who is the son of Wilma Dykeman, who's wrote very eloquently in her book, The French Broad, about the construction of the railroad up the mountain and the tragedy of the loss of life of these incarcerated laborers back in the 1950s. We also got the head of the NAACP in McDowell County, who is our vice chair, Ray McKesson. And then we ended up with interestingly, two African-American chiefs of police, the chief of police at Old Fort and the chief of police at UNC Asheville, Eric Boyce. And so it's been a wonderful group to work with, and we, you know, it was kind of one of those almost build it and they will come kind of things. We really didn't know what we were doing. But right off the bat, we wrote a proposal to go to the Old Fort Board of Aldermen to ask permission to put up a memorial at Andrews Geyser. And you know, if you know anything about McDowell County, very conservative, but Chief Lytle, who is African American, again, it's small towns. He is chief of police, but he's also on the Board of Aldermen. He really talked to other members of the Board of Aldermen. He called us out of the blue and said, hey, can you come to a Board of Aldermen meeting? I think it was August 10th. And so in a very short time period, we had the permission of the Board of Aldermen to do this. And so then the challenge came, of course, to publicize this and raise funds to make it happen. And so we have been working on that ever since. We have a website you can see there, the Rail Project. Ashley McGee Whittle, who works in special collections at UNC Asheville, but also she has a deep connection to this project because she's from Old Fort, and her grandfather and her stepfather worked for the railroad for a long time. And so she put together our website, which, you know, has some great resources, a lot of links to, we've been fortunate to get a good deal of coverage of this in news media, you know, from the Mountain Express to Spectrum News, which is, you know, nationally, I think, distributed kind of thing, to WLOS and, you know, several other media outlets that we have gotten publicity. We've also gotten the support of of course, the Old Fort Board of Aldermen, the McDowell County Board of County Commissioners, the Board of Aldermen in Black Mountain, and we also have the very welcomed and enthusiastic support of State Representative John Ager, who's also been able to help us get some needed funding from the McClure Family Foundation. And so, you know, that's been our project. We have recently commissioned, this is in the picture here, this is a picture of the kind of the memorial and, you know, telling what Andrews Geyser is all about. And this was put up by the town of Old Fort. And it talks about Andrews, and it talks about the site itself and stuff like that. So what we are doing is we're going to build this is about 5 feet tall. I think it's about 5 feet by maybe 4 feet, something like that, of, native stone. And so we are going to build one that kind of opposite this to the, and we have written the language, and I think I haven't talked to Steve lately, but we had sent that to the Old Fort Board of Aldermen for approval. And we have also commissioned a memorial maker to carve, engrave granite pieces, 2 granite pieces, one for the front and one for the back. And the front will be a dedication to this, to the memory of these incarcerated workers who built and sacrificed, and in many cases died. On the back of it, we have Anchesky Smith was discovered that, and we've been through this currently, the whole question of who gets counted in the census. But in 1880, for whatever reason, they wanted to count everybody. Sometimes they don't want to count everybody, but they wanted to count everybody. So they counted people who were in stockades along the railroad. And so we have those people's names. We also have the names of some people who were in the newspaper, usually, unfortunately, as people being shot trying to escape. So we're taking all the names that we have and putting those names on the back of the memorial as well. We have also contracted with a stonemason who's an African-American man from Old Fort, and we're very excited about that. And he will start construction on the memorial probably in May or June. So we're looking at hopefully a dedication coming up in the summer for this. In addition to this, we have applied for some grant monies. Anchesky Smith has been our grant writer and our treasurer. And she has applied for a couple of grants. And so we are also looking to put up, what are called Wayside Memorials, information panels that give more detail about what went on. A couple down here at Andrews Geyser, and then a couple up at the Swannanoa Gap. There's currently a Civil War wayside up there, right on the right at the top of the gap on Ridgecrest Conference Center property, and we've received permission from the Ridgecrest Conference Center to put a couple of panels up there. So we are hoping those grant funds are going to come through, and we'll be able to do that. I will mention, if you go to our website, again, therailproject.org, and scroll down on the main page, there's a button there that says donate. And so we are still needing some money we're pretty close, but we still need some funds to put us over the top. So if you would consider that would be awesome. And we would welcome that, and we would also put you on our mailing list to send out our newsletter, which is called Railings. That comes out whenever I find time to do it, basically. So I'm working on the second edition right now. But again, it's an exciting thing. We are very committed to the fact that this is something that has long been needed. I think all of us on the committee feel strongly, and of course in the news recently, this has been a big topic in this state and in and in Asheville and in other places, the whole question of taking memorials down. And so as a historian, I think, there are times when that is the proper course, but there are also things that are deserving of memorializing. And we feel strongly that this is a real gap in the historical record here. And so we feel a need to do this. And again, a real passion about this. And again, this has moved much quicker than we ever anticipated this happening. And again, we hope that by the summer that we will have a memorial up at Andrews Geyser, and then hopefully soon after, information panels as well to publicize this important history. Again, you know, Asheville owes a huge debt to these individuals. Asheville would not be what it is today. I mean, the population of Asheville in the aftermath of the construction of the railroad and the opening up of the railroad in 1880 to Asheville, you know, more than doubled in a 10-year period. And of course, Asheville very rapidly expanded in the aftermath of this. So there's a huge debt there to people who got no benefit from this. Wilson became a very wealthy man doing things you couldn't get away with today, selling timber to build the railroad in particular. But we need to acknowledge this history and we need to honor it. So I'll stop sharing there. And Barbara, if there are questions that folks have, be glad to try and answer those.
All right. Well, thank you so much. My goodness, that was such an interesting presentation. And I was able to go and check out the name of the gentleman who delivered the mail at Duke and then was recorded. He went by his nickname of Shorty, and his last name was Love. So Shorty Love was his
Shorty
name.
Love, that's right. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, Barbara.
There was a question about whether in the 1800s there were other big infrastructure efforts around the country. Someone mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge and maybe the railroad over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Do you know anything about the composition of work crews there as compared to what you've been talking about here?
Yeah, well, you know, it's kind of been pretty well documented in lots of movies and things like that, you know, in the West, you had a lot of Chinese immigrant laborers there and Irish laborers as well. You know, a lot of in the Northeast were immigrant labor. In the South, the use of incarcerated persons was pretty common. And in fact, you know, one of the more famous projects was the construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, which runs through West Virginia, the mountains of West Virginia. And this is where the story and the legend of John Henry comes from. And I really highly recommend a book by a historian by the name of Scott Nelson called Steel Driving Man, where he goes out to try and find you know, was there a historic individual named John Henry who, you know, was this legendary steel driving man? And it's a fascinating book in terms of his search for John Henry and his thought that he found him, and he interprets the song and the meaning of the song and the history of the song as well. But that was another convict labor infrastructure. Again, most of the infrastructure projects from railroads to later road building, I mean, this continued. You know, you had the so-called chain gangs, you know, into the 20th century in lots of southern states, and in some cases, you know, going well into the 20th century. This type of thing. The most abusive period, though, was this period of the 1870s, where, you know, again, it was a pretty horrible death rate on a lot of these projects.
Okay. Someone also mentioned, is this related to the Craggy Mountain Line Railroad? Do you know anything? Does that name?
Yeah. Well, there's what happens when the railroad comes into Western North Carolina and into the Southern Appalachian region as well. It really opens up the resources for exploitation. And so in the primarily the early years of the 20th century, a number of well-capitalized timber companies moved into the region, because this area was some of the richest hardwood forest in the world, and so they were trying, and very little of it had been logged, and so they came in and brought all sorts of steam equipment, and they built railroads, people who may live here now, you look out over the mountains and you see trees everywhere. But between, about 1900 and the late 1920s, railroads, spur railroads were built off of the main lines of the railroads and up into every cove and hollow, all the way up to, Craggy, all the way up to the top, close to the top, Camp Alice at Mount Mitchell, in the Smokies, all the way up to the State Line Ridge. And all this area was clear cut. And so if you saw this region in the 1920s, the mountains were virtually denuded by that point. Of course, as it was cut in 1911, the Congress passed a bill called the Weeks Act, which allowed the Forest Service to purchase lands east of the Mississippi River. And so a lot of this land, well over millions of acres, I think close to 2 million acres or so in western North Carolina, eventually became part of the Pisgah-Nantahala National Forest. And most of that land was bought from these timber companies who had clear cut it. And then they pulled out their railroads, but they're paying taxes on the land. And so they very happily sold it to the federal government. So those kind of railroads came in the aftermath of the construction of the main line of what was called the Western North Carolina Railroad, and then eventually became part of the Southern Railroad that went from, if you'd say Old Fort all the way to Murphy, and then crossed over into Tennessee, and then north from Asheville up the French Broad River, down the French Broad River to Paint Rock on the Tennessee line there, where it connected with a railroad coming from Tennessee. And then other railroads were built along the way. But a lot of these railroads were owned by these timber companies who built them up. They're narrow gauge railroads using a specialized engine that could negotiate steeper grades. And to exploit the timber and take it out. So there, a lot of trails in Western North Carolina, a lot of hiking trails, a lot of roads follow the grades of these old railroads.
Thank you. A couple of people are curious whether, given that you have the names of some of the laborers, whether there's any possibility of contacting descendants to alert them to what's going on with the memorial project.
Yeah, we have, as part of our grant request, we have asked for some research monies as well. And we have we've already, one of the neat things about working at UNC, the students at UNCA, they're just some amazing students. And so we have a student now who actually is doing an internship with the Western North Carolina Historical Association. And she's just an incredible, enthusiastic researcher. And so we're hoping to get some funding to get her to do some additional research, particularly on these names, and trying to, yes, we would love to be able to do that. And if that happens, to have family members at the dedication. And so that's something we're trying to do, and hope to do some research, some genealogical research, and try and find out more about some of these people, and of the few names that we have. But again, we're thrilled to have names, to actually be able to put on the memorial.
Great. And sort of picking up on that, another question. Wondered whether, is there any record in the laborers' own words that's been left as to how they felt about this? Were they resigned to their fate? Were they, I don't know what there might be.
Yeah, we don't, there's nothing that, in terms of, perhaps the interviewers with the WPA during the New Deal years, interviewed lots of people. We don't have any records of people that were interviewed that worked on the railroad, and probably most of these people were illiterate, and so we don't have any memoirs or anything like that. So we mainly have the testimony of people who, we do have some testimony of people who saw the camps, who saw the laborers working, and described that, and described the working condition that they were laboring on. But the only voice that we have really are the words to that song, which is, I think that gives an indication of how they felt, but, Swannanoa Tunnel, that's my home, babe, that's my home. And then there's a lot of talk about death and in this song. So, it's not a happy song. And so you can imagine that, and I can imagine that there was a lot of resignation going on. Obviously, some people tried to escape, some people weren't able to escape. But it was, a really difficult situation for these individuals, many of which, the ones that didn't die, bore the scars of it for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And I think, in fact, one of the alternative names for that song is Somebody Died, Babe.
Yeah.
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 I had another question. Were there some women, incarcerated women, also involved in this in any way?
Yes, there were, and I think we have a few names of women included in that. But there were some women, and we have some sketchy details about that. And evidently, they were used as like laundresses and cooks and things like that. And these were, again, overwhelmingly African American as well. So so we do have some indication, although we don't have a lot. We have more information about the type of labor that the men were doing. But there were some women who were brought in again to serve those roles.
All right. Someone mentioned the Saluda grade. Its construction was separate, I think, from this, but
Yeah.
Is it parallel in some ways, and would it relate to the rail project, the memorial?
Well, it does. We have, one of the interesting things has been connecting with other people who are doing this type of thing. I don't know of people doing this type of work on the Saluda grave, but as I understand it, I don't know that as much about it, but that was also incarcerated labor as well. We do know there is a group out in the far western part of North Carolina who's working on a memorial out in Jackson County. There's a site there where near the what's called the Cowie Tunnel, where there was a ferry accident in the construction of the railroad, where a ferry sank with incarcerated workers chained together on that ferry. And I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 or so drowned in that accident. There's some folks at Western Carolina who've been working on this, and some other folks in the community to build a memorial. And they have actually have pretty strong evidence of a grave site there, and a mass grave site. We have, we are trying to see if we can find and document grave sites, but and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we don't have any real hard physical evidence yet. So it is something that we want to continue to work on to see if we can mark some of these sites. But they have been able to identify that on that section. So there are efforts around. There was also, it looks as if it's not going to happen, but John Ager had, some of you may have read his editorial in the Citizen, a month or two ago, where he had proposed repurposing the Vance Monument as a memorial to the railroad workers. And so that's apparently not going to happen at this point, although we would love to see their, on Pack Square memorial as well, because again, this meant so much to Asheville and its development, and I think it would be very appropriate to have some sort of memorial there on Pack Square as well.
Oh, that's interesting, because that was certainly key to the big boom that started Asheville's this area
Absolutely.
expanding in such a fast way. Someone's curious how supportive the North Carolina prison system has been to your research. Do they have?
Well, these are public records, and so it's and they're housed at the state archives, and
Okay.
so they're readily available. And there is a good documentary record because it was a state project, and so we have penitentiary records. Not all, we don't have information on individuals and stuff like that, but we have reports that the penitentiary system had to make to the legislature. And then there were a couple of legislative. I mean, this was not something that everybody thought was great. A lot of people were touting how wonderful this was, and ignoring really what was going on with the workers. But there were people in the legislature and in the public that were very much decrying what was going on. So there were a couple of legislative investigations, and so we had the reports from the legislature, from those investigations, and plus the regular reports that Wilson and other people associated with the railroad had to make to the penitentiary system. So we got a good documentary record. And again, we know, and they had to, they were required to report deaths. And so that's where we get those numbers from the penitentiary report. So there is a pretty good documentary record, again, because it was a governmental action.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course those deaths were recorded as losses to the contractor.
Yes, well, to the state actually, because the state was a contractor in this case.
I think maybe we'll consider this one of our last questions. Our last question, but do you think John Ely's book, The Road, is a good depiction of? It's a historical novel, and yet it seems very well researched. Do you think it's a good?
Yeah, John. I like to. Well, as I grew up in West Asheville in an era when West Asheville was not at all cool. It was the opposite of cool. In fact, people in Asheville generally refer to it as worst Asheville at the time I was growing up there. But I often contend that every good thing that came out of Asheville actually came out of West Asheville. So, we have a number of noted authors that came out of there, included Olive Tilford Dargan and John Ely. We have people who are in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. We have, all kinds of great things came out of, noted photographers and other folks, first round draft picks in Major League Baseball. And John Ely is one of our old West Asheville claims to fame. And John, of course, and I highly recommend his historical novels. And The Road is my favorite. A number of his, I've been mystified because I think 3 of his novels have been made into Hollywood movies. And why The Road hasn't been, I don't know, because it's a gripping story. Now, John did do a lot of historical research, but John was also a novelist. And so there are things, if you read that book, and I won't go into detail, the escape train going down the mountain, all of that didn't happen, but it makes for good drama in a novel. And so and the revival service and the preacher and all that kind of stuff that ties in with this, that's John's imagination. But I think he does a good job of kind of capturing the real drama that occurred and the real tragedy of the construction of the railroad up the mountain. And so I recommend it. And actually, I was going to mention real quickly a couple of opportunities coming up with the Western North Carolina Historical Association. One of those is a book discussion of the road, which will be led by Steve Little, who actually knew John Ely, and Richard Starnes. Again, I think I don't know if I mentioned Richard earlier. He is the provost at Western Carolina University, also a West Asheville native, and a cousin of John Ely's. And so Richard and Steve will be leading that discussion. That's April 13th of the road And you can find this information about these programs at the Western North Carolina Historical Association website. And then on April 17th and the 18th, Steve Little, I'll be along for, I don't know, like the Gabby Hayes or something like that, like the sidekick for Steve Little. But Steve Little will be leading hikes on both those days. I believe on the 17th, that's at 10 o'clock. And then on the 18th, I think it's 1. So it's a Saturday and a Sunday. There'll be 2 hikes that will be going along the railroad, and Steve will be talking about, the construction and all that went on there, and so we'll be going by a number of tunnels along the way. So you'll be able to see a lot of, what's left there, in terms of what these incarcerated individuals did. So those are great opportunities. And again, you can find out information on the Western North Carolina Historical Association website. And there are charges for these things, but again, it would be worth your time to, both events, but particularly doing a hike with Steve along there, because there really is no one that knows more about that stretch of railroad than Steve Little.
Oh, great. That's great to hear about, Dan. They may have to add a third one after.
Well, that'd be great. That would be great. We'd be happy to do that.
Well, gosh, we sincerely thank you for this. It's been so interesting. We've learned a lot, and I know people are interested. They were sticking around to ask questions. So I also want to thank my committee members. We've put together a few things for you, but we're always interested to hear if any of you attending have ideas for us for speakers in the future. You can contact me or my co-chair, Jane Yokoyama, Bruce Jones, Sue Kibler, Martha Marshall. We'd all be interested to hear that. Next week, April 2nd, will be all about COVID from Missions Director of Epidemiology. And then 2 weeks from today, Dr. Marcia Gordon will share her insights about non-commercial films and how they portrayed race at the time. These presentations do end up online, not immediately, but they will show up. So you can look on the website and check the OLLI Observer also for the future Fab Fridays coming your way. So Dan, thank you again, and thank you to everyone who tuned in with us today. So long.